March 2nd. The Minnesota Senate Tax Committee will come to order. Members, I'm sure we are all still smiling at the budget forecast that was released on Friday. There was a lot of good news in there for us as we move forward and as we think of our state's economy rebounding. And to start off today, members, we will start with a little bit of a deeper dive into those top budget forecast headlines. And so we'll welcome Dr. Laura Kolombakidis, our Minnesota State economist, to give us a presentation on that really astounding turnaround. We need to really thank our Minnesotans for their grit, not giving up, hanging on, and really working to keep folks employed through this pandemic. So Dr. Kolombakidis, welcome to the committee. And I'll also have you introduce yourself, and I also will recognize Britta Rattan, our Minnesota State Budget Director, should the two of you want to go back and forth in your presentation. Dr. Kolombakidis.
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. Senators, glad to be here this morning. I am, for the record, Laura Kolombakidis, Minnesota State economist. I'm here with State Budget Director Britta Rattan. We're going to walk through our budget or forecast release information, and Britta Rattan is going to start out. So do we have the slides available? Great. So I am going to turn it over to Budget Director Rattan.
Thank you, Laura. And for the record, my name is Britta Rattan. I'm State Budget Director at MMB. I know you're probably most interested in this committee and hearing from our state economist on the revenue side, so I will just move quickly through the overall picture here. If you'll flip to the next slide. So at a very high level, as the chair mentioned, our budget outlook has really significantly improved with this forecast in all years that we're projecting, but for the 22-23 biennium, which we are setting the budget for right now, we are now projecting a positive balance of $1.6 billion for 22-23. You'll hear from Dr. Kolombakidis that we have an improved U.S. economic outlook, and really much of the improvement with this forecast is in response to the federal pandemic relief that was not included in our November forecast. And Dr. Kolombakidis will talk a bit more about that, but there was the December legislation, and now our national forecasters are assuming passage of a subsequent bill at $1.5 trillion. So I will also then speak in a little bit more detail, but relatively quickly when we get to this part, that the state spending estimates are also adjusted downward due to federal support and medical assistance. So we are seeing additional increased federal medical assistance payments, as well as lower estimates in our education spending. And then Dr. Kolombakidis will also discuss how unemployment continues to disproportionately impact our lower wage workers. So even though we're seeing significant improvements in the state budget picture, that doesn't always translate to what Minnesotans are experiencing in their own households and in their own experience. And so we'll talk a bit about that as well. If you'll turn to the next slide. This slide just provides a high-level look at the numbers, comparing where we thought we were with our November forecast updated for the December special session with our February forecast projections that we have currently. One piece that's important to point out is that a big portion of this change comes from the improvement of the 2021 biennium. So essentially our balance in 2021 with this forecast improved by $546 million. And you'll see that reflected in the forecast change column for the beginning balance. So essentially the assumption is that we are rolling forward an additional $546 million out of this biennium into the next and improving that beginning balance for 22 and 23. Then Dr. Kolombakidis will walk you through the change on the revenue side, but we are showing improved tax revenue collections of about $1.4 billion. And then, as I mentioned, spending projections are down by about 456 million, and then there's a small change to the stadium reserve. So overall, you can see that the forecast change between where we were at the end of the December special session and where we are with this February forecast is nearly 2.5 billion in change. So we don't typically see a change this large between a November and February forecast. And Dr. Columbakidis will talk about the unique situation and the unique changes in federal policy that really have contributed to this change as well. So if you'll turn to the next slide, I just want to highlight one more thing before I pass it to Dr. Columbakidis. This is just another way to look at that 22-23 balance. It is 1.57 billion that we're projecting in 22-23, but I want to highlight some of the pieces of that balance that are more one-time in nature. So part of the balance in 22-23 is the use of the 491 million in the budget reserve that was booked at the end of the 2019 session as part of the budget deal that passed. So at that time, we put in statute that we would use 491 million of the reserve at the beginning of 22. That was in order to achieve balance in our projections for 22-23 at the end of that session. So that is currently in law, that we would take 491 million out of the budget reserve at the beginning of fiscal year 22, and that contributes to the bottom line balance. So that is baked into the $1.57 billion number. Additionally, I mentioned that the carry forward grew in this forecast, but now we're projecting that 940 million carries forward from this biennium into the next. So really the piece of the change that is just due to revenues exceeding spending in 22-23 is 260 million. So that's what we would refer to as the structural balance, just the revenues in that biennium exceeding the projected spending in that biennium. In order to make the math work, we also have to then, from all of these items adding together, we subtract out the growth in the stadium reserve. That's because as those revenues grow and get dedicated into the reserve, that comes out of the bottom line balance calculation, so that gets subtracted. But that's what gets us to the bottom line of 1.57 billion available for 22 and 23. And with that, I will pass it to Dr. Columbakidis to dive into the economy and the revenue side.
Dr. Columbakidis.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Britta. I will start with the U.S. economic outlook and how it has changed since November. I'm going to move to Minnesota's economy, and then I'm going to turn to details of our new revenue forecast. So in the chart you have in front of you, we're showing the U.S. economic outlook and how it's changed. The height of the bars in each case shows annual U.S. real GDP growth. The blue bars show the history and the February forecast, or the current forecast by our consulting firm IHS. And the green bars show IHS's November forecast for real GDP growth. And that, of course, is the forecast that informed our November 2020 forecast. So if you look in the history, so sort of the middle to the left-hand side of the chart, you can see the economic contraction or the decline in real GDP. So it's below the bar during the last recession, when GDP fell 0.1% in 2008 and 2.5% in 2009. And then you can see the 10 years of growth that followed. So what followed the last recession was a record long economic recovery and expansion period. There's some variability in the growth rates in those years, but it's pretty steady, fairly moderate to low growth through those 10 years. Now, if you look to the right-hand side of the chart, you can see the extreme volatility in the economic picture that abruptly ended that record-long economic expansion in February of last year. IHS now estimates that real GDP declined 3.5% last year, with annual growth returning this year at a rate of 5.7%. So that's what they're forecasting in their February outlook, before decelerating to 4.1% next year, and then growing on average 2.5% per year for the rest of the forecast period. So after next year, the remainder of the forecast period, the growth rates look pretty similar to what we saw prior to the pandemic disruption. IHS expects real GDP to regain its pre-pandemic peak this year, but the economic recovery has been uneven and it's expected to continue to be uneven. GDP associated with production of goods has already reached its pre-pandemic level, and the service sector of that part of GDP is not fully expected to recover until after a significant portion of the US population is vaccinated against COVID-19. The current forecast for the current year, for 2021, real GDP growth is 2.6 percentage points higher than the prior forecast. This is a large forecast change to see between November and February. So that alludes to the volatility in the economic outlook that affects volatility in our revenue forecast. The primary reason for that big change from 3.1% in November to 5.7% now, the primary reason for that change is the inclusion in the February forecast, IHS's February forecast, of the impact on the US economy of two significant rounds of federal pandemic relief that were not in the November forecast. First, the $900 billion package that Congress passed at the end of last year. And second, IHS is assuming $1.5 trillion of additional federal relief from a proposal that Congress is considering now. So it's passed the House. It's the package that they're referring to is the one that has a $1.9 trillion price tag as it's moving through Congress. But IHS in their February outlook is assuming $1.5 trillion gets infused into the economy. IHS expects that to be enacted this month, and and it starts to affect the economy, starts to improve economic growth in the second quarter of this year. So the economic impact of those two measures is baked into our economic forecast, even while, as the budget director said, any direct payments to state and local governments that arise from anticipated federal legislation is not. So despite the improvement in the forecast, the US outlook remains volatile and uncertain and depends critically on the path of the pandemic. In this forecast, IHS assumes that the rate of COVID-19 infections continues to recede following last month's peak. So they're assuming that the peak of COVID-19 activity in general was last month, and that things will continue to recede from there. They now expect widespread effective population of the US population will be achieved by the fall. In the next chart, I'm illustrating the forecast change in real consumer spending. So consumer spending is 2/3 of GDP. So changes in this component have big impacts. So movements in consumer spending affect the economy significantly. And it has been the case that throughout that 10-year economic expansion and recovery from the last recession, consumer spending was really the engine of that recovery, and it's continuing to be the case here in this recovery. We also often show the forecast change in US real consumer spending because we build our forecast of Minnesota's sales tax off of forecasts of consumer spending of various types at the US level. And so changes in the consumer spending forecast will pretty directly affect our sales tax forecast. The additional federal stimulus and an improving COVID-19 situation prompted IHS to raise their forecast for real consumer spending for both this year and next. After a decline of 3.9% in 2020, IHS expects spending to grow 6% in 21, an increase of 2.4 percentage points from their November forecast. They forecast 3% average annual growth from 23 to 25. So IHS and others have examined what happened last year when we had federal stimulus payments. The federal government sent household stimulus checks. And the evidence is that those stimulus checks did indeed support increases in consumer spending above what would otherwise have occurred. But they also supported increases in savings. So we had a very high spike in the personal savings rate last year in the United States. So because of that evidence, IHS has carefully incorporated saving assumptions into their assumptions of what happens with the additional federal stimulus checks that are expected to be paid out. So IHS assumes that not all of the stimulus is spent in 21, and some of that is available to support spending in 22. The pandemic-induced economic downturn that began in February of 2020 brought severe disruptions to Minnesota's economy. And so in the next slide, I'm moving to talking about Minnesota and comparing it to the US. During 2020, the state experienced job and wage losses, a reduced labor force, shifts in consumer spending patterns. And in this forecast, the improved outlook for US economic growth in 21 and 22, that is supported by those federal pandemic relief spending, that drives our expectation that the wage and job losses of last year are going to be followed by positive employment and wage growth through our forecast period. This chart compares Minnesota's labor market to the nation's via the overall unemployment rate. So the gray line here is the United States unemployment rate, and the blue line is Minnesota's unemployment rate. Minnesota's unemployment rate has fallen since its peak of 9.9% in May of last year. In December, the state unemployment rate fell to 4.4%. That is the most recent data we have. So we're looking forward to new labor market data coming out soon. That was down from 4.5% in November and well below the US rate of 6.7%. It was the 12th lowest unemployment rate among US states. However, the lower unemployment rate does not tell the full story. In December, the decline in the unemployment rate was the result of a reduction in the labor force rather than from unemployed job seekers finding work. Since the onset of the pandemic, Minnesota's labor force has fallen by 102,000. And we have 35,000 more unemployed people who are looking for work than we did last February. Over the last year, Minnesota lost 248,000 jobs, with the largest gap in industries most affected by social distancing and disease containment measures. So those face-to-face personal interaction industries. Between February and December of 2020, Minnesota's leisure and hospitality sector lost 123,000 jobs, 44% of that sector's February employment. And those job losses have disproportionately impacted low-income workers. Workers in that sector earn 46% less per hour on average than the private sector as a whole. With the next slide, I'm moving to
Dr. Colin Bakitis.
Yeah.
Before you leave this slide, if I could just ask for one clarification. Regarding the large number of job losses, I think you said 220,000 job losses. I know there's been, can you pin down a little bit who might have been losing those jobs? I mean, there was a very compelling figure nationally about the number of women actually, that these job losses have been affecting women even harder. And I just want to know, is that the case in Minnesota? What can you tell us about that? We can think about schooling and all those type of things, but could you just speak a little bit about how this is affecting women or these job losses in general?
Sure. Madam Chair, members of the committee, those data were striking at the US level. We don't have the same level of detail and of that kind of information at the state level, but here's some things I can tell you about the impact on women in this recession. First of all, that the leisure and hospitality sector has a disproportionate number of employees who are women and people of color. And so just by virtue of that sector having lost a lot of jobs means that a lot of people in those categories have lost jobs. The labor force, the women in the labor force is actually higher now in actually December of 20 over December of 19, which again are the most recent data we have. And it may be that the data haven't caught up to this situation completely for the state. But at the point of December, there were more women in the labor force in Minnesota than in December of 19, but there were fewer women employed. So women did lose jobs. However, there appears to have been on net women who have entered the labor force to look for work. So what I can say about that is that the data that we have now for Minnesota, even though your intuition is right and the story at the US level is certainly right, the data for Minnesota don't quite tell that story at this point. That doesn't mean that, it could mean that there are different experiences happening in Minnesota, but it could also mean that it's a data anomaly, and after some more months of data catch up, we'll see a clearer picture.
Thank you, Dr. Kolombakidis.
So if we move to the next chart, I'm moving to our forecast for Minnesota. And in this chart, we show the annual growth rate in total Minnesota wage and salary income. So this variable is all of the payroll disbursements of all of the employers in the state of Minnesota. And the height of the bar in each case shows the growth rate in that amount. The blue bars again show the history and our current forecast, and the green bars show our November forecast. Again, you can see the decline in total wage income that occurred in the previous recession. So that was that 4.8% you see back in 2009. We're now forecasting a decline of 0.6% this year. That's a smaller decline than we expected in November due to the improved economic outlook, and moderate growth averaging 5% annually thereafter. Now, that 0.6% is negative, and as you can see, it's unusual for us to show a negative, a decline in wage growth, but it is relatively small. It's smaller, of course, than what we saw in the previous recession. And that relatively small decline in wage income last year, when the unemployment rate peaked at such a high level, arises because unemployment in this economic downturn has disproportionately impacted lower wage workers. We know, for example, that a large share of unemployment insurance benefits claimants in Minnesota were from lower wage occupations. So the wage decline is smaller than it would have been if unemployment had been more evenly distributed across occupations with a wider range of average wages. So now let's talk about the revenue forecast in the next slide. The first two columns of the table show the current forecast and forecast change for the current biennium, fiscal years 20 and 21. And the next two columns show the same for the next biennium. Total general fund revenues for 20 and 21 are now forecast to be $463 million more than in the November forecast. The income tax forecast is lower than in November, and forecasts for all other major tax types have been increased. Individual income tax receipts are now forecast to be $100 million less than the prior forecast. So we had a lower estimate in this forecast. We had a lower estimate for tax liability in tax year 19. Tax year 19 is the base year for our income tax forecast model. So when that base is lower, that lowers our forecast. But we also had other forecast adjustments that lowered the income tax forecast for the remainder of fiscal year 21. State sales tax revenue is now forecast to be $77 million more than the prior forecast. The higher forecast is consistent with the increased forecast growth in consumer spending I mentioned earlier, and it's also due to higher sales tax collections so far this fiscal year. The corporate tax is projected to generate $238 million more than the prior forecast, and that's based on a higher forecast for corporate profits this year and higher collections so far in this fiscal year. The current forecast for total revenues in the next biennium is $1.423 billion higher than the prior forecast. And the forecasts for all major tax types have been increased. It's important to remember when looking at especially the next biennium forecast here is that FY22 and FY23, that's the period, especially 22, is when most of the positive impacts of those assumed federal fiscal payments hit both our income tax and our sales tax. The higher income tax forecast is primarily due to higher expected wage growth and also higher expected growth in non-wage income. The sales tax forecast benefits from a higher starting point from the higher current biennium forecast and faster expected growth in taxable sales. Now, in the next slide, I want to talk a bit about the extraordinary volatility and uncertainty in the economy in the last year. So since our February forecast, so February of 2020 forecast, we've seen volatility associated with the pandemic, the very abrupt economic downturn that then occurred, and then significant infusions of federal fiscal support. And those have driven large changes in our economic and revenue forecasts. But we're not back to where we thought we were 1 year ago. Of course, you can see from the from the labor market information I gave you that the economy is certainly not back to where we were 1 year ago. The revenues aren't either. So in this chart, the height of the bars shows our revenue forecasts for the current biennium on the left and the next biennium on the right. And the green bars show our February 2020 forecasts. So I almost always just compare the revenue forecast to the immediate prior forecast. So in this case, back to November of 20. But we thought that because of everything that's happened in the course of the year, it might be useful to see what's happened over the course of the entire year. So looking February to February. And the blue bars show today's forecasts. So the distance between the height of the bars in each case shows you how far our current forecast is from the one we released 1 year ago. Our revenue forecast for the current biennium is $1.2 billion below what we forecast in February of 2020. For February 22 and 23, our forecast remains $461 million short of where it was in February. Let me close in the last slide with by reiterating some of the risks that I've talked about in this, the risks to this forecast. I mentioned that the economic forecast depends critically on the path of the pandemic and the timing of when we achieve widespread effective vaccination of the population. The full economic impacts of the $900 billion in federal relief that was enacted at the end of last year remains uncertain. We do know that those stimulus payments were paid out in January, and we did see the impact on consumer spending of that payout. There was a boost in consumer spending in January, but we haven't seen everything that was expected to result from that stimulus package. And the additional $1.5 trillion assumed in this forecast hasn't yet passed Congress. So those effects are in the future and uncertain as well. There's uncertainty about when consumers will feel safe enough to return to more normal spending on services, and about how much of the expected federal fiscal stimulus payments they'll spend and how much they'll save. This forecast depends on business owners having enough confidence in the recovery to boost investment in their businesses. A setback in business investment would slow growth below forecasted rates. During the recovery, consumer spending is expected to be supported not only by those federal relief payments, but also by improvements in household wealth from rising home and equity prices. So in the United States, the main sources of household wealth is the value of your owner-occupied home and your financial portfolio. And when people's wealth increases, they tend to spend more. That's called a positive wealth effect. But a significant decline in household wealth, for instance, from a correction in volatility in the financial markets, a correction in equity prices, that would create a negative wealth effect that would slow growth below forecasted rates. And finally, with 28 months remaining until the end of the next biennium, of course, for that biennium, we haven't collected any of the revenues that we are forecasting here. So even for the amount of time that we have left, even small changes in assumed rates of growth in important revenue sources can have big changes in the outlook for that biennium and the next. I will now turn it over to State Budget Director Britta Rayton to go over some of the expenditure points, unless you want me to take questions now.
I just have one question, Dr. Kolombakidis, that I think goes to the presentation that you just presented.
Mm-hmm.
So it's welcome news to see the great change in the forecast, but I'm just curious, is there a way to know, and maybe Budget Director Rayton would know this better, so I'll guess I'll put the question out there for whomever might be able to answer it, but there are so many Minnesota businesses that are struggling and just hanging on by a thread, basically. And of course, that affects all of their employees as well. And I'm just wondering, do we have some sense of the economic health of our economic engines, those job providers, those people that produce paychecks? Is there any light that either you or Budget Director Rayton can shed on that?
I can take that on. We, of course, in the industry, especially in industries that, so Madam Chair, members of the committee, especially in industries that have been affected by social distancing measures and safety concerns, they have had a really dramatic roller coaster of a year, with changes in consumer spending, changes in restrictions. All businesses in Minnesota over the course of the year have been affected by the pandemic and the economic downturn. Even the businesses that have been doing well, their business plans had to be rewritten. So nobody's business plan that they wrote in February of 2020 is relevant now, right? So everyone has seen some disruption. We know that the data on things like business startups, business bankruptcies, business closures, those things lag the economy. And so we don't have a lot of current data on what's going on with specific businesses, but DEED has done some analysis of data that they have. And if I remember correctly, they estimated that around 10,000 businesses closed down at least temporarily last spring. And that of those businesses as of the summer, I think it was in June, about 3,000 of those businesses were still closed. Now, what does that tell us? It tells us that there was some recovery over the course of the summer, but I don't think it tells us very much of the full picture of what's going on now, because June was, a long time ago, and a lot has happened since then, and we've gone through the winter. So I think the answer is that we know that there are a significant number of businesses that are struggling, and we know that both from looking at business data, but also looking at that employment data and the parts of the economy that have not been able to bring people back yet. And we consider all of that in our income tax forecast. So that, for instance, in the income tax forecast, we have forecasts for wages and salary income, but also business income. So those businesses that are pass-through businesses where the income is taxed on the individual income tax, we're incorporating that information on that side.
Thank you, Dr. Kolombakidis. It does remain, I understand it being a lagging indicator, but there's great concern. Maybe we can do some things to alter that lagging indicator. Thank you so much. Senator Weber, I see your hand up, and would you like to offer a question now, or we also have Budget Director Britta Rattan, who will finish the presentation. Oh, Senator Weber, I'm afraid you're on mute. We see your lips moving.
Thank you, Madam Chair. My question is for Dr. Kolombakidis.
Dr. Kolombakidis.
Thank you. Part of the opposition that's being expressed at the federal level to the current package in front of Congress is the fact that there's $1 trillion previously appropriated that has not been released into the economy. And so my question for you is threefold here. Number one, have the state projections fully considered that $1 trillion that has not been released into the economy? Number two, if the current package fails or is greatly reduced, do you have a off-the-cuff projection of how that would affect the current forecast? And number three, what is the potential long-term negative impact on our projections due to the fact that the federal government is now printing money with wanton abandon?
Dr. Kolombakidis.
Madam Chair, Senator, this forecast, as I said, the U.S. economic forecast includes the impact of the $900 billion bill that was passed at the end of 2020, and IHS has a variety of assumptions about where and when that money hits the economy and what the impact is. So it isn't as if they see a bill pass and then they dump $900 billion into their models and see what happens. Instead, they are paying attention to the fact that the stimulus checks that were paid out in January led to an increase in consumption in January. They're paying attention to the fact that that there was a variety of types of spending and where those things occur in the economy. What happens if the bill that is in Congress doesn't pass was one of your questions. And the biggest change between the November US outlook and the February US outlook are those two stimulus packages. So if the $1.5 trillion that IHS is assuming gets infused into the economy does not happen, then that brings down that real GDP growth forecast below the well below that 5.7 and gets closer to the 3.1 that we had earlier. So it starts to look somewhere between what our November forecast looked like and what our February forecast looks like. And that's roughly, I mean, I can't give you details on this because we haven't run alternative scenarios, but roughly that's true for revenues. So for example, what kinds of things will be affected in the income tax? Well, on the income tax, if we didn't get the unemployment insurance benefit extension and the supplemental unemployment insurance benefits that are assumed in the current bill that's making its way through Congress, then that would lower our income tax forecast for our lower liability for tax year 21 and lower revenue for fiscal year 22. If those stimulus checks that are expected to happen, the $1,400 that's expected to happen, if that doesn't happen, then that would lower our forecast for taxable sales in Minnesota because it would lower US real consumer spending. So that's what the impact was. And the last one, your last question was a macroeconomic question about putting money into the economy.
Right.
The impact of that. Yes, there's a lot of discussion and thinking and research on the part of macroeconomists right now about the impact of federal spending of this magnitude and what it means to increase the debt to GDP ratio to the point where it is now. And one of the things that's going on is that 10-year economic expansion that I showed you, where real GDP grew steadily and had fairly low growth during that time. We also had low inflation during that time. And so one of the reasons that might be is that we had labor market slack at the time, meaning that we had more people on the bench. Like maybe unemployment was low, but there were people who weren't working. Now, this wasn't really the case in Minnesota. In Minnesota, we had very high labor force participation during that period. But in other parts of the country, it was true. And when you have labor market slack like that, the economy can keep growing without causing inflation, without wage growth causing inflation pressure. And so there is a school of thought now that in the economy we're in now, where we have lots of people who have dropped out of the labor force, lots of people who are unemployed, that a stimulus like this is not necessarily going to stimulate inflation beyond levels that are problematic. And so that we can put money into the economy without having negative effects with regard to inflation. Now, it certainly does increase the debt to GDP ratio for the federal government. And ultimately, that money does have to be paid back. And at some point, a very high debt to GDP ratio is going to have a drag effect on the economy. But the forecasters, most of the forecasters that we're looking at, we have a variety of forecasts from different companies in our book, are not seeing that kind of an effect all the way through our planning estimates here.
Senator Weber, are your questions answered?
I'm fine for now. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Dr. Kolombakidis, just on that GDP slide 5, I noticed too that it was unusual that in years 23, 24, and 25, actually between the December and February forecast, we saw a decline in anticipated GDP. It wasn't very much, but it was a decline. And I also noticed in slide 8 that we saw a decline in projected wage increases between 24 and 25. And so I'm just curious, what's happening then? Now, if that's too long of an answer, we'll call you back another time. But I will say it is noteworthy and it's a bit concerning.
Yeah. Madam Chair, members of the community, members of the committee, very careful, close reading of our charts there. So what happens when we get out to 23, 24, 25 is that the forecast for real GDP growth, and I was trying to look for if the consumer spending looks the same way, not quite. But yeah, our wage forecast looks that way too. So it's not a decline in GDP, which would be the growth rate going below the horizon, so being negative. So it's not a decline, but it is a negative forecast change, meaning it's slower growth than what had been forecast in November. The reason for that is, I believe, is because in the previous forecast, IHS had assumed that the Fed was going to start raising interest rates in 2026. So meaning that the economy was going to keep growing and grow a little hot, and then inflation was going to start to pick up, and the Fed was going to get concerned about inflation and start raising the target for the federal funds rate in 2026. In this forecast, because economic growth early in the forecast is faster, IHS assumes that point happens sooner. So that means that the point at which we get monetary policy, quote, liftoff. So the point where the Fed decides, okay, it's time to slow growth down a bit and try to contain inflation, that occurs 2 years sooner in 2024 in this forecast than it did in the prior forecast. So interest rates are not high throughout this forecast, but they start to grow sooner. They start to get higher sooner in this forecast than in November. So that contains real GDP growth sooner in this forecast than it did in the prior.
Thank you. That does explain that. Okay. I do see, so it's still good news. It's not that there's some impending doom out there in 23, 4, and 5. So thank you for that explanation.
Mm-hmm.
Senator Baak.
Well, thank you, Madam Chair. Dr. Klumbakidis, I was reading something, and I don't want to get into too much into national politics, but I was reading something, I think over the weekend, about this $1.9 trillion stimulus, and the individual that wrote it was kind of questioning the wisdom of that. And, there's the issue of the national debt, but his question was, why does the economy need a stimulus like this when the U.S. savings rate is going up so exponentially? And I don't know if you saw that, but I think he indicated that in February of 2020, there was about $1.4 trillion parked in savings that Americans had saved, and that number has grown to almost $3 trillion over the last year, more than doubled the amount of money people now have in savings. So I'm just curious kind of what your observation of that is, assuming that's accurate. And do we have any data like that on Minnesota? But it would be very interesting to know economically what's happening. How much money are people parking in savings during this very extraordinary period of time? Dr.
Klumbakidis.
Yeah, Madam Chair, Senator Baak, to answer the last question first, I don't have data on Minnesota's saving rate. It may be that it's there, it's available, and I just don't have it in front of me. So I'll get back to you on whether that's something that we can find. We don't forecast it though. So I don't have a forecast of that. Regarding the US saving rate, indeed, last year did see a huge spike in the saving rate. And that coincided with or was supported by federal pandemic relief payments. So as I said, consumer spending was supported by those payments, and consumer saving was as well. So some of that may be, so if you were to look at a time series graph of personal income and a time series graph of consumer spending, the consumer spending graph is smoother and the personal income graph has some variability in it. And that's because consumers can use saving and borrowing to smooth out their consumption. So you generally think of, that consumption is going to be steadier, have steadier growth and not have as much volatility as income. And it looks like that's what people did, that getting this extra income last year, they spent more than had been expected, but they also saved more. And one of the reasons that may have been the case this time around is because of the really unusual situation where we couldn't pay for some of the things that we wanted to. So travel, for instance, entertainment, arts, going to ball games, all those kinds of things are not available to us. And so we get income, and then we're going to hold on to it. And IHS and other forecasters are assuming that created some pent up demand. So some people, not everyone, some people have the means to consume later this year, or to spend, later this year and next year. And they're going to do it in those periods when once we have a widespread vaccination, people feel like they can spend that money. So the increase in the saving rate was not something that is a permanent increase. It's not as though there was a permanent shift to a higher propensity to save on the part of Americans or Minnesotans. Instead, it was something that was an artifact of having additional money in terms of those extra unemployment insurance benefits and stimulus checks, that stuff came in at a time when some forms of consumption simply weren't available to us, or some forms of consumer spending weren't available to us.
Well, that's helpful. Thank you. It's a little troubling to know that the federal government, in some cases at least, are borrowing money, increasing the debt, only to have the individuals who receive it putting into savings. So not sure they've got the program kind of tailored to get the maximum economic output that we'd hope to get out of it. But yeah, maybe you're right. Maybe some of that spending is pent up, and maybe people will really unleash and bring some of that savings down when they can, and get a little more comfortable to move around. So thank you.
Thank you, Senator Baak. Senator Rest.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Following Senator Baak's comments, I think it might be helpful to us also to recall the economic activity following 9/11, and also the economic crisis at the end of the first decade of this century, and what the savings and spending patterns were at that time. I seem to remember after 9/11, the advice was go shopping. Consumers were encouraged to spend as part of the recovery from the emotional shock, if you will, of the devastation in New York City after 9/11. And I just think it might be interesting to see those two numbers again, just like Senator Baak was referring to the federal savings rate now. And I think we actually, I'm not the economist, of course, but I think it makes sense that people didn't have money to spend on things that they wanted, and gradually they're going to. And I think it makes sense. It's common sense that people are going to start spending on travel, spending on Twins packages for games and so on, that they just didn't have the opportunity to do before. So I think we need to keep that in mind, which doesn't in any way excuse the federal government for not justifying their increasing the national debt. So thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Senator Rest. Seeing no more questions, we'll move on to Budget Director Britta Rattan to finish the presentation. Dr. Rattan.
Thank you, Madam Chair. If we could turn to the next slide, I will just walk quickly through the changes on the expenditure side of the forecast, just so we get the complete picture of the forecast change. So as you can see on this slide, we're looking at the forecast change in the 2021 biennium, as well as the change in 22 and 23. So overall, our spending projections are down by 83 million in 20 and 21, and 456 million in 22-23 compared to our prior estimates for these time periods. So you can see on the chart, E12 education spending is down 39 million in 20 and 21 from our prior projections, and 165 million in 22 and 23. And there's really two significant reasons for the changes across the 4-year period. So in 20 and 21, the change is due to lower pupil projections. The impact of the lower student counts was reflected in our November forecast, if you recall. But this, with this forecast, we have actual data reported in December, and we're showing a further decline than we had previously forecast, with families delaying kindergarten start, or opting for private school options, or opting for homeschool during the pandemic. So in total, the student count in this forecast for the current school year decreased by approximately 4,000 more students relative to our November projections. And when we compare to the student projections we made a year ago for this current school year, so in our February forecast 1 year ago, we are down 16,700 students in total. And so that is contributing to that change in the current year. And those decreased numbers do contribute to the change in 22-23 as well. Although we are assuming the majority of students do return next year, it does still depress the numbers relative to prior forecast in 22 and 23. But really the biggest component of the change in 22-23 is in the area of compensatory funding. This is the funding that's based on free and reduced lunch counts within schools. And what we're seeing is our compensatory funding forecast for 22 and 23 is down by 113 million. So that makes up a large part of that change in 22 and 23. And the aid for next year, so the aid for the school year starting next fall, is based on the free and reduced lunch counts by statute in this current year. And in this current year, due to remote learning and changes in the federal meal reimbursement requirements, we're seeing fewer families are filling out the forms to be counted as free and reduced lunch. So that is contributing to a decline in our compensatory aid calculations for the 22-23 biennium. Moving to the Health and Human Services area, you can see, oh, I'm sorry, back one slide. You can see that there's also a decrease relative to our November forecast. The HHS forecast is down 54 million in 20 and 21 and 257 million in 22-23 relative to our prior estimates. A significant portion of the change in 20 and 21, 35 million of that $54 million change, is due to reduced utilization of the CCAP program, the Child Care Assistance Program, in the current year. The change in 22-23 is primarily due to the assumption that the federal health emergency will continue through the end of this calendar year. So when the federal emergency is in place, we receive an additional 6.2 percentage points during that emergency period for our federal match for medical assistance. So the federal government picks up a larger share of our medical assistance program, which reduces our state spending on medical assistance. So because we're assuming this additional 6 months of the federal emergency, and we're making that assumption based on a letter from the federal government indicating that this was the intention, because we're assuming that additional 6 months, that lowers our state share of medical assistance by 305 million in 22 and 23. So that really more than accounts for the change in 22 and 23 in our HHS forecast. I want to highlight, we'd already recognized this increased federal assistance through the end of this fiscal year. And so the change with this forecast is adding just an additional 6 months through July through December of this calendar year. So if you turn to the next slide, this slide provides a similar look to the one that Dr. Kolumbakidis walked you through, but on the expenditure side. So what we're comparing is our expenditure projections from this forecast to our February forecast 1 year ago. So before we knew the impact of the pandemic. And you can see across that 4-year period, our expenditure projections have declined by about $1.8 billion. The largest piece of the spending change is due to the increased federal support for medical assistance that I just mentioned. That was not included in our February forecast a year ago. And over this time period, we are now assuming that we have this increased federal match for 2 full calendar years. And overall, that reduces our state spend on medical assistance by nearly $1.2 billion. So that's by far the largest piece of this change in our expenditure forecast over the 4-year period. And then the other significant point of change since last February is in E12 education. And so largely brought about due to changes from the pandemic as well, with fewer students in our public schools. And so overall, our education estimates across the 4-year period during this last year have decreased by approximately $500 million. So that really contributes to the remainder of the change overall in our expenditure forecast in the 4-year period. So if you turn to the last slide, this returns to a view of total revenues and expenditures in the general fund. And this slide is showing both the upcoming 22-23 biennium and gives a first look at the 24-25 biennium, or what we often refer to as the tails. And this slide is looking at the structural balance in the next 2 biennia, which means we are just looking at the revenues in that biennium compared to the spending in that biennium. So we're not taking into account dollars rolling forward or any use of the reserve. And so this is where you can see that we have a structural balance in 22-23 of $260 million. In another piece of positive news, that balance grows in 24 and 25. So the structural balance in 24-25 is $845 million. The reason for that growth in structural balance, you'll see it reflected on that annualized growth column, is that we are projecting in this forecast higher growth on the revenue side than in the spending side. However, the spending side is just a base level of spending. So we obviously don't have budgets in place yet for 22-23 or 24 and 25. So given that the spending is just a base level of spending, we also include an estimate of inflation, because we don't include inflation, as you all know, in our forecasts on the spending side. So the estimate of inflation is reflected below. It's about $1 billion in 22 and 23 and grows to $2.5 billion in 24 and 25 because it compounds over the 4 years. And this is just a CPI level of inflation applied to all of the components of our spending that don't already have some sort of inflationary factor built into the formula, or they're not based on actual costs, which would count inflation in the underlying forecast. So with that, that concludes my remarks. I'm happy to take questions, or if you have further questions for Dr. Kolumbakidis.
Members, I'm not seeing any more questions. Thank you both for the good report, also the thorough report. Members, I know that Dr. Kolumbakidis and Budget Director Rattan will be available if you have further questions. For now, we're going to move on to the next portion of our business today. And with that, members, we will take Senate File 263 off the table. So I move that we take Senator Baak's Bill 263 off the table. This is the PPP conformity bill that we dealt with quite early in session, you might recall. We had great support in this committee to get that conformity out early regarding the loan forgiveness, not taxing that in Minnesota's income, and the deductibility of those PPP paid expenses. And we just had to wait till that budget forecast came in before we could take further action. And with that good budget forecast that we have had, we are now in a position to move this bill to the floor. Could someone second my motion, please, to take Senate File 263 off the table?
So moved.
Senator Rest, thank you very much. With that, Senator Baak, to Senate File 263, in addition to the great budget forecast, I know you also have a technical amendment. Would you like to present that technical amendment, which I believe is the A7?
Well, Madam Chair, let me temper expectations a little bit about the budget forecast, because
Senator Baak.
I think all of us need to remember it's mostly one-time money. So doing things, Madam Chair, you're a former education chair, like putting money on the K-12 formula under the current forecast is going to be pretty difficult because you need to pay for it in the outgoing biennium if we're going to be in balance. So there are significant challenges remain, even though I think the news stories are reporting certainly a good turnaround, but I think a lot of people are still going to be a little disappointed with the outcome, because expectations tend to increase exponentially when the word of the surplus hits the newspapers and the TVs, because there's a lot of people with a lot of good ideas in this state, and I think their expectations they're going to be able to get some things done go up quite a bit. Madam Chair, I think I have two amendments. One is the A2. Let's move that. I'll move that first.
Oh, Senator Baak, yes, I have the A2 amendment. You're welcome to move that.
I'll move the A2, Madam Chair. It's something that the department has asked for. It's a clarification of the 179 expensing that we did back in, when did we do that? October, I guess. They're looking for some clarification on that. It costs, the tax committee a small amount of money, about $5 million. But to really make that work right, we need the A2 amendment. And I'd be happy to have council walk through it if people would like to hear kind of the rationale.
Thank you, Senator Baak. Senator Baak will move the A2 amendment. I know that we have someone from the department here that can speak to that. It's a Section 179 cleanup language that the department has asked for. And I believe we might have Joanna Bears on today. They did submit a letter as well, members, which I know you'll have with you in your email box. Ms. Bears, welcome to the committee. If you could kindly just give a brief explanation of why the A2 amendment, this Section 179 cleanup language is needed. Ms. Bears.
Sure. Thank you, Madam Chair, members of the committee. For the record, my name is Joanna Bears. I'm the Legislative Director for the Minnesota Department of Revenue. So as you know, in October, when the 179 bill was passed, there was two instances we found out after the fact where it was identified that Minnesota taxpayers may have to add back a portion of their federal Section 179 expensing amounts for the 2020 tax year. The first instance is where taxpayers have carryover amounts pursuant to the Section 179B3 of the Internal Revenue Code for property that was placed in service in taxable years beginning before January 1st, 2020. And then the second instance is where shareholders and partners of S corporations or partnerships that file a calendar year, but the flow through entity files on fiscal year. This is also an area where it's causing some issues that the 179 fix or the 179 bill that passed in October does not address.
Thank you, Ms. Bears. And the revenue estimate on that, I know we spoke of that some time ago. Can you refresh my memory and the committees as well about what that revenue estimate is? Ms. Bears.
Sure, Madam Chair. Thank you, Madam Chair, members of the committee. It's a cost of $5.2 million in the first fiscal year, and then it's a raiser of 1.4 in the following fiscal years, and that's because it's a timing tax, and so because it's shifting, there's an increase in later years.
Thank you, Ms. Bears. Senator Baak, do you have any further comments on the A2?
No, Madam Chair.
With that, members, please turn on your cameras and your volume. Oh, Senator Rest. A question, Senator Rest.
Yeah, thank you, Madam Chair. This was a clarification that we identified a while ago, and members will see it as this language, this identical language as a bill introduced on Thursday's bill introduction. So I want to just make sure that I think this is a very good clarification. It's a very small cost to make everything right. And and we hope never to see 179 again. I think, Senator Baak, after this clarification, but it will also be on bill introductions on Thursday. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Senator Rest. And members, I do support this amendment. I had this amendment prepared, and I have to say, when I entered the Senate in 2011, one of my first bills was Section 179 conformity. So it's taken a long time, but I really salute all that we're able to work this through in the last year, and we'll hopefully today we'll be putting this A2 on there to really finish up what was started regarding the Section 179. Certainly a big help to Minnesota farmers, Minnesota businesses. With that, members, all those in favor of the A2 signify by saying aye, and some visual demonstration as well. Aye.
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 Okay, 1, we have a quorum. 2, the A2 amendment passes. Senator Baak.
Well,
your
Madam Chair,
next amendment, which might be your technical amendment.
Madam Chair, I have another one, the A7, if that's the one that you have.
Yes, that is the technical amendment, Senator Baak.
Well, Madam Chair, the A7 amendment just clarifies that if items are being able to take, if a business is able to take deductions on their federal return for under the PPP exemptions, that they also would be able to take those same exemptions under the Minnesota return. So I think it's just kind of a clarifying thing to make sure the Department of Revenue follows the same kind of rules as the federal government is relative to deductibility of expenses.
Senator Baak, first of all, that is my understanding, but what I would like to do is have our counsel, Ms. Pollock, walk through the A7 amendment, what it actually does, and then I see Senator Rest has a question. Ms. Pollock.
Madam Chair and members, yes, I would have nothing more to add to Senator Baak's description of the amendment. His description would apply to the language on lines 1.6 to 1.12. And then the language on 1.2 to 1.4 is just kind of a clarifying and a correction of the reference to a qualifying entity that is eligible to make the option to be taxed as a C corporation. It's just kind of correcting making sure that definition is referenced correctly, and it's very technical and corrective in nature.
Thank you. Members, any further questions? Senator Rest, is your hand up for a question on the Baak A7 amendment?
Yes, I just wanted to make sure, and Ms. Pollock did clarify that this amendment is not just about PPP, but it is about the C Corp election at the state level as a response to the SALT cap from the TCGA, and I think I really do appreciate it that it came forward from Chamber and from CPAs to just make sure that there's no mistake in interpretation about the C Corp election. It obviously clarifies the PPP as well, but it's a very important clarification for the C Corp election, and I'm very pleased that that's included in this bill, because it's been my bill in the past, and I know Senator Nelson, you and Senator Chamberlain have introduced that language as well, but I'm glad we're taking care of it early, and the revenue estimate is unknown for the whole provision, because we really can't predict how pass-through entities are going to act. And sometimes that's a good thing with regard to the Department of Revenue. So I'm happy for that clarification. And I think the business community and those entities that may indeed elect to be taxed if it's to their advantage, and we always want taxpayers to act to their advantage in making that election. And thank you, Senator Baak, for bringing it forward, and thank you, Senator Nelson, for offering your bill, which is also the language that's in Senate File 263. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Senator Rest. And this is a good provision. And this is one of those rare times when actually this would not have a revenue projection for the state because it's a federal SALT cap. So we're glad about that. Any further discussion? And Senator Baak, we'll go ahead and adopt this amendment, but then I think you will want to do a brief run through of the three parts of your bill, which includes obviously the SALT parity for C-Corps. So with that, any other comments on the A7? With that, with your cameras on and your mics on, all those in favor of the A7, please signify by saying aye. Aye.
Aye.
Aye.
The amendment is adopted. And then Senator Baak, we have I'll wait on, let's go to your presentation, Senator Baak. I know, you presented this to committee. It passed with flying colors early on in session, but just for those joining today, if you could briefly talk about the three sections of your bill and what you're addressing. Senator Baak.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Back in March, the federal government passed the first round of a provision called the Paycheck Protection Program, where businesses, certain businesses, not all businesses, but businesses with under 500 employees could get a loan from the federal government through the Paycheck Protection Program, that if they maintained their employment of their employees, 60% of the loan would have to be spent on salaries, no less than 60% on salaries and benefits. The balance could be spent on things like your mortgage, other business expenses. But if you maintained your employees over the period of time, then the loan could be forgiven, or portions of it forgiven. There were about 102,000 of these loans in Minnesota, totaling about $11.3 billion. And businesses were told when they took these loans out that they wouldn't have to pay taxes on these loans if they were forgiven. The federal law was very clear on that. So if they ended up being converted to a grant, businesses wouldn't have any tax liability on these forgivable loans. What I think most businesses did not know is under current Minnesota law, these forgivable loans were considered as taxable income in Minnesota. So when they got around to filing their 2020 income taxes, which is coming up this month, they're going to have to pay Minnesota income tax on these forgiven federal loans. So what the bill does is treats the loans like the federal government does. It says that these forgiven loans are not going to be taxed at the federal level or at the state level as income. The other thing that the bill, that's the first provision. The other provision is it allows businesses with this forgiven loan money, essentially grant money, to be able to take deductions for the allowable expenses that they incurred that were paid for with the loans. The third provision in the bill is one that dates back a little further, actually. Back in 2017, when the most recent federal tax bill was passed, some states really benefited a lot by that, other states not so much. And the big factor was whether you benefited or not was the cap that was put on state and local taxes of $10,000. In a state like Minnesota and maybe New York and California, states that have a relatively high income tax, those caps meant that at some point in your income, it was going to be very difficult to itemize because they weren't no longer itemized expenses. So the challenge that prevented for S corporations, businesses that were not C corps but S corps, so they take their income flows through to their personal tax liability, is you could, let me use an example, it might be easier for people to understand than to me walk through it. If you were somebody who owned a bank and you were not a C corporation, but you were an S corp, you could only deduct on your income tax a cap of $10,000 for things like your property taxes, even though your property taxes might be 10 times of that, and certainly seem to be a legitimate business expense, were a legitimate business expense before the new federal law passed. So what this does is it allows those S corporations, and there are a lot of them, I want to say 170,000 or so, there's a large number of S corps that now will be given the opportunity, if they choose to file as a C corporation. So their tax rate will actually be a little bit higher than, well, I guess probably depending on their income, but for most of them, their tax rate will be a little higher as a C corp than it is an S corp, but they'd have a different set of deductions, be able to take some more of those business deductions, especially relative to property taxes, when they calculate their tax liability. So it's a pretty important change. It doesn't allow for businesses to be able to do it on a year-by-year basis. It says that if you're going to do that, you have to do it for a minimum of 4 years. At least 50% of the owners in the S corp must take it, so the majority of the company, and then everybody in the company has to file that way. So, Madam Chair, it's a little down in the weeds as it relates to tax policy for most people to follow, but for people that are in this universe of being S corps who were negatively impacted with their business expenses, it's a pretty important provision. So those are the three pieces. Those are the three pieces of the bill, Madam Chair. And the total cost when we put in the 179 expensing clarification is about $441 million. Largely one time. There's a little bit of tails in it, but it's about $441 million in the upcoming biennium. Good news is it's one-time money, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Senator Baak. And thank you for the description. And believe me, those S Corp, C Corp folks are watching your in the weeds description. So that's a critical piece, as well as the payroll protection plan conformity. And I don't want to lose sight of the fact that this is one-time money. And as we saw in our budget forecast, that's a lot of where we will be focused is one-time. You always want to use one-time money for one-time things. And that's exactly what Senate File 263 does. Senator Rust. Oh, Senator Rust, I believe you're on mute.
Yes, Madam Chair, is now the time when I can offer my amendment?
Yes, Senator Rust.
Well, Madam Chair, maybe before we get to Senator Rest's amendment, there's
Sure.
one little piece that I forgot, Senator Rest. It's that, you know, businesses during COVID, during 2020, many of them, even though they took the loans, don't have tax liability. They didn't make any money this way. So the income exclusion won't do them any good because they didn't have tax liability. So again, in the weeds in tax policy, there's a provision called net operating losses. This allows them to carry forward those losses for 5 years, right, in order to take advantage of the income tax exclusion on the PPP loan. So I'm sorry, Senator Rest, for interrupting, but I think that's okay. An important provision for people watching to know.
Thank you, Senator Baak. We'll go back to Senator Rest, who I believe has an amendment. Senator Rest.
Madam Chair, I see that Senator Dietzig raised her hand, and I was wondering if it was about the comments that Senator Baak just made before I offer my amendment.
Senator Dietzig, let's go to those comments first. Senator Dietzig.
Thank you, Senator Rest. Thank you, Madam Chair. My question is regarding the net operating losses, NOLs. If Ms. Pollock could explain, I just want to clarify that the carryover, carry forward, carry back period for net operating loss, I believe was adjusted in the TCJA. So in the federal bill in December 2017. And then does this further change that? So they, I believe, limited some of those carry forward, carry back, look back periods in the TCJA to help pay for it. And then I'm just wondering what this does. Does the current federal bill allow for more expansive use of the net operating losses? If Ms. Pollock could clarify that. And sorry to spring this on you.
Thank you, Senator Dietzich. Ms. Pollock, to the net operating losses.
Madam Chair and Senator Dietzich, yes, I will have to look up the TCJA to get the specifics on that. But it's correct. I think there was some limitation placed on the NOLs in order to create a kind of a relatively small amount of revenue in the TCJA. As Senate File 263 applies to Minnesota's application of carry forwards, I don't think the TCJA treatment would have any effect on this because we have our own separate NOL treatment. And so net operating losses would be carried forward as under current law for these businesses that weren't able to use who could carry net operating losses as a result of the deductions in this bill.
Senator Dietzich, did that answer your question?
Yes, thank you. And again, sorry to spring that question on you. Thanks.
All right. Thank you, Senator Dietzich. I don't see any other questions. So I see Senator Rest's hand is up. Senator Rest.
Thank you, Madam Chair, for the A8 amendment, and then I will explain it.
Thank you, Senator Rest. Members, you should have a copy of the A8 amendment. And with that, Senator Rest, if you could explain the A8, please.
I'm happy to, Madam Chair. I had the pleasure of working with you, Madam Chair, and with Senator Baak, Senator Gazelka, and looking on another aspect of the impact on Minnesotans from the CARES Act. And part of that was something called the FPUC. And it is one section of the CARES Act that was passed and signed by President Trump on March 27th. And it allowed $600 additional unemployment compensation for 17 weeks to be sent out, to be administered by the states and sent out to those who qualified for it. And part of the qualification was the impact of COVID-19 in the explanation to workers that came out from the Department of Revenue. What it allows is, because when they were sending out the deed was sending out the checks, and hundreds of thousands of people who were out of work, it was really thought to be the most important thing was to get that $600 into the hands of affected workers, and in addition, afterwards, the $300. But as they explained it, to develop and test and implement a new system, the new system functionality to allow for tax withholding would have significantly delayed the payments. So they just sent them out. But that means that at most, workers who during that period received $10,220 of income that ordinarily as unemployment insurance, just as loans, by the way, forgiveness of loans are usually taxed. They did not have their tax withholding. So the same kind of equity considerations for these individual workers is what prompted this amendment. If we did the whole amount, it would be an astronomical number. What occurred to me in working with staff and with your suggestions too, and we're having ongoing conversations, was that if even a portion of that could be set aside from taxable income, it would be kind of like part of this three-legged stool that I believe this bill is going to be going forward. The PPP loan forgiveness, a significant gesture at what an extrapolated cost is of about $30 million to help Minnesota workers, and the House and the other body, and I'm sure you too, Madam Chair, again, as former chair of the Education Committee, and of course Senator Chamberlain is the current one, is money that's needed right now for individuals, for businesses, on their tax returns, and for school districts planning summer school. And we're going to have a great bipartisan package, I believe, going forward. Individual workers who were out of work, businesses that got these PPP loans and needed them to survive and still need to survive without the tax implication, and our school districts. So, Madam Chair, I continue to work on this bill. Again, we have a revenue estimate only if we had done the whole thing, and Mr. Wilms has done what I think is a reasonable extrapolation of what the revenue estimate would be, and I hope that you would support it, and I certainly welcome your help.
Thank you, Senator Rest. Members, I do support the amendment, but I do want to make sure the caveat is there that we still do have work to do to more finely target this. But what I want to be very clear today is the Senate Tax Committee, in a very bipartisan way, is very focused on helping Minnesotans and their employers recover quicker from this pandemic and the economic downfall that has come with that. And that is the spirit of the bill that you see before us today, Senator Baak's Bill 263, the amendments that have been added, particularly the A8 amendment. Normally, members, I would be a bit reluctant to add an amendment that is not quite finely tuned before we send it to the Senate floor. But time is of the essence here. And while there's a tad bit more work I think we will be doing on this A8 amendment, make sure that the funding actually gets to those who need it the most. I do support it today. We are in an unusual time. We need to get this bill moving. And so I will be supporting the A8 amendment, knowing that we'll be doing just a little bit more clarity, also to make sure that we have more clarity on that revenue estimate as well. And Senator Rest and I have spoken about this as well. And I believe that we are in a good place. And I would encourage your adoption of the A8 amendment. And I see Senator Baak has his hand up. Senator Baak.
Madam Chair, I appreciate the fact that Senator Rest has found a way to narrow this up some. The overall cost of doing all of that unemployment people received is in the neighborhood of $200 million. I think it'd be very hard for us to send that to the floor today, but Senator Rest, I appreciate it. I like the amendment, although, Madam Chair, it creates a little anxiety for me because over my time in the Senate, I've seen tax conformity bills that must pass come to the floor of the Senate, and all of a sudden they attract a lot of mischief because they're not an omnibus bill, so they're open to amendment. Bills can be made even larger than they are, and the sky is kind of the limit. So my preference with conformity bills is to encourage the president to rule that anything that's not conformity should not be germane to the bill. And I haven't always been successful with that. I remember one time we actually got a conformity bill onto the floor and started to attract amendments, and we had to table the bill, and they had to contact Governor Plenty at the time and say, listen, if we want to get this passed, we got to stop some of the shenanigans on the floor. And we were able to bring it back and got it done in a timely way. So it's gonna rest. That's my only anxiety when we get to the floor, that all kinds of things can break loose. But I am hopeful. I support the amendment, and I am hopeful that the Senator Gazelka and Speaker Hortman can find an additional provision maybe to this bill that will really make it really bipartisan. I know there's some talk about potentially putting some money in this bill so school districts can prepare for summer school. They need that money earlier so they can start to work on their budget and know from a staffing level what they need to do. They got contractual requirements with the teachers union that they need to work through. So I know those conversations are going on. I'm hoping that the leaders would be able to get us to a place where we could get this bill to the floor with one additional amendment that's agreed bipartisanly agreed to, and then not other amendments, because there is some urgency in getting this done with the tax filings on this. So, Madam Chair, I just wanted to kind of get that on the record for people that think we're going to have a food fight on the Senate floor. The result of that might be not getting this bill done in a timely way, and that would be too bad. Madam Chair, that's all I have to add.
Yes.
I do support the amendment.
Thank you, Senator Baak. And I would just say that those are words of wisdom and words of experience. And the reason we're looking at the amendment here in the tax committee today and moving it out today is so that we do have the time to actually do a little bit more work and get a bit more accurate estimate on what this exemption from the state tax on unemployment, the $600 unemployment bonus piece per week. So we will be doing that. And I do think this is a good admonition. Some of us have thought maybe we need to have a conformity omnibus bill so that some of those floor shenanigans that we see in amendments being offered for various reasons would have some parameters on them. But we don't have a omnibus conformity bill, but we do have, I believe, 67 senators who are laser focused on trying to help their constituents recover. And that is my hope going forward. And fortunately, we do have the president of the Senate on our tax committee. And I know that he was here today as well. And so it is important, I think, that we move this forward and know that there will be some additional work done as before we get to the floor. And the admonition would be, let's get this done when we get on the floor, save amendments for other bills, not these early action conformity bills. And Senator Rest.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Kids, workers, and businesses. That's what this bill can become. And what could be more bipartisan than that? And the reason of doing it now is the urgency of the tax deadlines and the and summer school. And I offer this amendment in committee because in committee it is germane. Mr. President, Senator Miller, quite frankly, on the floor of the Senate, this amendment would not be germane, and I would not be offering it because it is not a conforming, it's anticipating conformity, but it is not itself conforming. But then neither would the summer school. So we'll see how it works to bring that in. But doing it now establishes the beginning of a very strong bipartisan Senate position. And again, I appreciate the leadership of Senator Baak and Senator Nelson, and I hope you'll support my amendment. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Senator Rest. And members, and for the public watching, I do want to be clear, our discussion strayed even a bit further than the A8 amendment, but the A8 amendment in front of us today that we are voting on is in regard to the $600 per week unemployment bonus, I believe is what it was called. and not taxing Minnesotans for that. And as you can tell, we will be having further discussion moving forward. And I see Senator Chamberlain. Senator Chamberlain.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just a quick question. I'm sorry. Do we have an idea the dollar amount on this exemption then?
Madam Chair and
Senator
Senator Chamberlain, if we did the whole $10,220, which would be the 600 times 17 weeks, the estimate that Mr. Wilms, through working with the research department of the DOR, it was around $200 million. At $1,500, extrapolating that, it's about, a little bit less than 15%, and so that led to an extrapolated revenue cost, if you will, taxpayer benefit of around $30 million or a little bit less. And Mr. Wilms, I see, has his hand raised, and he can amplify that estimate.
Mr. Wilms.
Madam Chair and Senator Rest, Senator Rest gave a really good summary of kind of the mechanism for arriving at the estimate. The caveat, of course, that I have to put on this is that I don't do these estimates, for the committee, and we depend on the Department of Revenue. So while we're assuming it's in the range of 30 to 50 million, we've engaged with the Department of Revenue to get an official estimate on this provision, but it's our best guess that it was less than 50 million. Again, this would be one-time money for the first fiscal year effect. And so I think that's kind of a good summary of what we're dealing with at this moment.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Mr. Wilms. So members, we are ready to vote on the A8. I do not see any further discussion. Mr. Wilms, is your hand still up? Okay.
Sorry, Madam Chair, just forgot to take it down.
Yes, I know that happens to me too. All right, members, those in favor of the A8, be sure you have your camera on, your audio. All in favor signify by saying aye. Aye.
Aye.
No? Seeing all ayes, the A8 amendment is adopted.
Thank you, Madam Chair and members.
Thank you, Senator Rest. And now, Senator Baak, we have the 263 as amended in front of us. I know we're running just a tad late today, but I do want to allow members, we do plan on moving this bill to the floor, taking a vote and moving this bill to the floor today. I want to allow Senator Baak, if he has any closing comments, and members an opportunity for comments as well before we take our vote. Senator Baak, we've had a long discussion today, but do you have any final closing comments on your bill as amended?
Well, Madam Chair, I think everyone's had a good, thorough discussion of this. My only thought is we have colleagues over in the House. All of us have two of them. And I think bipartisanly, there's an understanding for some urgency with this in the Senate. But because the Constitution requires that bills that impact state revenue have to originate in the House, bad as the Senate might want to do this, we cannot get it on the governor's desk without the support of the State House. So to members on the committee and members of the Senate who might be watching, and frankly, the public who might be watching, please reach out to your members of the State House of Representatives, ask them to act in a similar way to what the Senate has and get a bill on the House floor for a vote, send it over to the Senate, and we'll work out our differences between the House and the Senate. And I really, really would like to get this on the governor's desk before the 15th of March. But unfortunately, Madam Chair, this committee can't do it on its own. We're going to need some help from across the street over at the State Office building. So, Madam Chair, that's my request is as members and members of the public, let's urge the House to act on this. A lot of people will be helped in Minnesota by this bill being enacted into law. So, Madam Chair, with that, I'd move that Senate File 263 as amended be recommended to pass.
And thank you, Senator Baak. I forgot to give members an opportunity to speak, and that will be your motion in just a moment. Thank you so much. Members, are there any comments on the bill? We have had a thorough discussion. I'm not seeing any further comments. So Senator Baak has moved that Senate File 263 as amended be recommended to pass and sent to the Senate floor. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. Seeing none. The bill is passed as amended to the Senate floor. Thank you, Senator Baak. Committee, Senator Rest. We, as the Senate, have taken a strong position here and an early position to get help into Minnesotans' pocketbooks, to the employers, to keep those employees on the payroll. And I thank you for that. We'll continue on, and we do hope we see some early action from the House so we can continue. Thank you, members. Our next meeting will be Thursday, March 4th. Today's meeting is adjourned. Thank you. Congratulations, Senator Baak.
Thank you, Madam.